The silver arrow. The forest of Blackwood did not breathe. It suffocated. Silas moved like a shadow through the gnarled oaks, his bow an extension of his scarred arm. He was a man of few words and fewer mercies, known in the village of Oakhaven as the hunter who never missed. Hunger was a constant companion in these lean years, and the village elders looked to Silas to fill the drying salt sheds. He tracked the trail for miles, the scent of musk and damp earth leading him deeper into the forbidden vale, a stretch of woods where the sun struggled to pierce the canopy. There, in a clearing draped in unnaturally thick mist, stood the great hind. She was magnificent, her coat the color of a bruised twilight, her eyes wide and swirling with a strange golden light. Silas notched an arrow. His breath hitched as he drew the string to his cheek. This kill would feed his family for a month. But as he looked through the sight, the deer didn't flee. She turned her flank, exposing a swollen belly. She was heavy with life, her movements labored as she lowered her head in a silent plea. For the first time in 20 years, Silas felt a cold shiver that wasn't from the wind. He saw the frantic pulse in her neck. If he released the string, he would be a murderer of the future, not just a hunter of the present. The darkness of the woods seemed to thicken, pressing against his lungs. "Not today," he whispered, his voice cracking. He lowered the bow and unnotched the arrow. "Go. Run before the others find you." The hind stood still for a heartbeat. Then, her form began to ripple like ink dropped in a basin of water. The deer didn't run, she expanded. The fur dissolved into robes of woven shadow, and the hooves lengthened into pale, elegant fingers. Before Silas stood a woman of terrifying beauty, her skin as white as bone and her hair a cascading river of midnight. "You chose mercy in a place where only death resides, Silas of Oakhaven," she said. Her voice didn't come from her throat, it echoed inside his skull, cold and vibrating. Silas fell to his knees, his bow clattering to the frost-covered moss. He knew the stories. This was Persephone's shadow, the queen of the Underworld, who walked the upper realm when the veil grew thin. I did not know," Silas stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "That is why the choice mattered," she replied, stepping closer. The air around her smelled of funeral lilies and ancient earth. "You spared my vessel and my unborn prince. For this, I grant you a gift that is also a curse. You shall hear the truths that others hide in silence." She reached out, her fingers cold as ice, and touched his ears. A searing pain shot through Silas's head, a high-pitched scream that made him howl. The world went black, filled with a sudden, deafening roar of voices that weren't human. The cacophony of shadows. The world did not return in colors, it returned in screams. Silas woke face down in the mulch, his head throbbing as if a rhythmic drum were beating against his skull. The queen was gone. The mist had thinned, leaving only the skeletal fingers of the oaks reaching for a gray sky. He tried to push himself up, but a sharp, chattering sound nearby made him flinch. It sounded like a serrated knife scraping against stone. He turned his head slowly toward a rotting log. A squirrel sat there, its black eyes fixed on him. "The heavy walker wakes," the squirrel chattered. Except, Silas didn't just hear the clicks. He felt the meaning settle in his mind like a heavy stone. "Does he still carry the stinging wood? Will he bite us from afar?" Silas scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stay away," he croaked, waving a hand at the creature. The squirrel tilted its head, its tail twitching with agitation. "The walker speaks our tongue. Strange. Dangerous. The elders said the queen marks the merciful with the burden of hearing. He will hear the rot before it reaches the surface." Silas clutched his ears, trying to block out the noise. It wasn't just the squirrel. High above, a murder of crows circled, their caws transforming into a gritty, mocking chorus. "Death comes to the stone nest. The soft skins will bleed before the moon fatness. Bright steel in the dark. Bright steel. The stone nest." Silas whispered. He looked toward the direction of Oakhaven. The village was built of heavy river stone, nestled in the crook of the valley. The crows. They're talking about the village. He gathered his bow, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. The gift was a sensory assault. Every rustle of a beetle in the leaves was a confession. Every moan of the wind through the hollow trees sounded like a warning. He began to run, but the forest was no longer a place of silence. It was a library of secrets, and every volume was screaming at once. As he reached the outskirts of Oakhaven, where the tilled fields met the tree line, he saw a stray hound, Old Blue, the village butcher's dog, sitting by the fence. The dog's ears were flat, and he was whining low in his throat. Silas slowed his pace, his heart hammering. As he passed, the dog's whine shaped itself into words of pure, shivering terror. The man with the cold eyes brings the long knives. Under the floor of the grain house, the sharp teeth wait. They will bite the chief while he sleeps. They will bite us all. Silas stopped dead. The grain house was the heart of the village, and the chief was a man who had treated Silas like a son. The man with cold eyes could only be Herrick, the chief's ambitious captain of the guard. The hunter looked at the peaceful village smoke rising in the distance. To everyone else, it was a quiet evening. To Silas, the air was thick with the scent of a coming slaughter, whispered by the very creatures they walked upon. He realized then that the Queen hadn't just given him a gift, she had drafted him into a war he wasn't prepared to fight. The silent hunt. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long bloody streaks across the stone walls of Oakhaven. Silas moved through the village square, but the world felt like a distorted mirror. To the villagers, it was the hour of the evening meal. To Silas, it was a roar of hidden agendas. He passed a tethered goat near the well, its bleat piercing his mind. The tall one with the scar carries a blade that smells of poison. He walks to the great hall. Poison and shadow. Silas's gaze snapped toward the great hall. There stood Herrick, the captain of the guard, leaning against a timber post. Herrick was a man of cold precision, his eyes like flint. He was laughing with two of his men, but as Silas approached, the laughter didn't reach his eyes. "Silas!" Herrick called out, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. "The legendary hunter returns empty-handed? The elders won't be pleased. We expected meat for the winter stores." Silas forced his face to remain a mask of stone, though his ears were ringing with the frantic chirping of sparrows in the eaves above Herrick's head. "The traitor! The traitor hides the iron in the grain. He will strike when the bell tolls twice." "The woods were silent today, Herrick," Silas said, his voice rasping. "The game has moved deep into the vale. I need to speak with the chief. I have news of the borders." Herrick stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. The air around him felt frigid. "The chief is resting. He's been feeling ill since the midday meal. I wouldn't disturb him if I were you, woodsman." Silas felt a jolt of ice in his gut. Since the midday meal. They had already started. The poison the goat sensed wasn't just on a blade, it was in the chief's cup. "I'll wait then," Silas said, turning away to avoid Herrick's searching glare. As he walked toward the stables, a mangy barn cat leaped onto a stone wall beside him. It hissed, its fur standing on end. "Run, two legs. The Cold-Eye Man has told the others you saw too much in the woods. They are coming to the back of the stable with the hempen rope. Run or hang." Silas didn't look back. He ducked into the shadows of the stable, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He heard the heavy crunch of boots on gravel, 3 men, moving with the rhythmic silence of predators. They weren't just guards anymore, they were Herrick's executioners. He climbed into the hayloft, pressing his back against the rough wood. Below, he heard the door creak open. "He's in here," a gruff voice whispered. "Herrick says he's acting strange. Said he was talking to himself at the gate. We can't risk him whispering to the chief's daughter." Silas looked around the loft. A small window looked out toward the grain house, the very place the animals said the coup's weapons were hidden. If he ran now, he was a coward. If he stayed, he was a corpse. Suddenly, a rat scurried across his boot. It paused, twitching its pink nose. "The floor is weak near the grain sack, Hunter. Push the beam. Drop the heavy sleep on them." Silas didn't hesitate. He found the loose support beam the rat pointed to and threw his entire weight against it. With a deafening crack, a massive pile of cured hides and heavy timber collapsed into the stable aisle below. Screams of pain and surprise erupted. Silas leaped from the loft window into the mud below. He had to get to the grain house. He had to find the sharp teeth, the dog had mentioned before the second bell tolled. The belly of the beast. Silas hit the mud with a jar that rattled his teeth, but he didn't stop to catch his breath. The village was now a labyrinth of hostile whispers. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, and the very air felt heavy with the scent of ozone and impending blood. He sprinted toward the grain house, a massive timber structure that sat on a raised stone foundation to keep out the damp. Above him, the village bell tower loomed. It had struck once. The second toll would be the signal for the slaughter. Under the wood, the cold bites. Under the wood, the sting waits. A colony of mice squeaked from beneath the floorboards as Silas approached the rear loading dock. Their voices were a frantic, high-pitched static in his brain. He found a small ventilation grate near the base of the building. With a grunt of effort, he pried the rusted iron loose and wriggled into the crawlspace. It was pitch black, smelling of dry husks and ancient dust. He crawled on his belly, his fingers brushing against something cold and oily. He pulled it into the dim light filtering through the floorboards above. It wasn't a sword. It was a crossbow, a weapon of cowards and assassins, forbidden by the chief's law. And there were dozens of them, pre-strung and tucked into oiled leather cases. Suddenly, heavy footsteps thudded directly over his head. "Is the shipment ready?" Herrick's voice was unmistakable, vibrating through the wood. "Yes, Captain," a younger voice replied, trembling. 40 bows. We've dipped the bolts in the hemlock extract as you ordered. One scratch, and the elders won't even have the strength to scream." "Good," Herrick said. Silas could almost hear the cruel smile in his tone. "The chief is already fading. His daughter will be distraught enough to sign the regency over to me before the sun rises. If anyone resists, clear the square." Silas felt a surge of cold fury. The chief's daughter, Ilara, had been Silas's only friend when the rest of the village mocked him for his woodsman's ways. To Herrick, she was just a piece of parchment to be signed. "He breathes the dust. The hunter in the dark breathes the dust," a spider hissed from a web near Silas's ear. "The cold-eye man hears the heart thump. Move, hunter. Move or be pinned." Silas froze. Above him, the footsteps stopped. Herrick had a predator's instinct. He had sensed a change in the air, a vibration that didn't belong in an empty grain house. "Did you hear that?" Herrick asked. Silas saw the tip of a sword blade poke through a gap in the floorboards, barely an inch from his shoulder. He rolled to the side just as the steel plunged through the wood. "There's a rat in the cellar," Herrick growled. "Burn it. Pour the oil through the gaps. I want this building a funeral pyre by the time the second bell rings." Silas scrambled toward the far end of the crawlspace, but he heard the slosh of liquid above. The scent of linseed oil began to drip through the cracks, soaking his cloak. He was trapped in a wooden box that was about to become an oven. The architect of the dark. The first spark hit the oil with a hungry whoosh. Flames licked greedily across the ceiling of the crawlspace, turning the darkness into a flickering, orange nightmare. Silas coughed, the thick, acrid smoke of the linseed oil filling his lungs. He was pinned. The exit he had entered through was already a wall of fire. "Help me," he gasped, his eyes stinging. He wasn't talking to God. He was talking to the shadows. The fire death comes. The yellow bite eats the wood. The mice were screaming now, 1,000 tiny voices of pure panic. "Follow the draft. Follow the cool breath of the earth." A massive rat, its fur scarred and gray, scurried past Silas's face. It didn't flee in random terror. It paused, looking back at him with obsidian eyes. "Big Walker, the stone is hollow behind the grain bin. The ancient ones dug a path to the well. Follow or burn." Silas didn't question it. He dragged himself through the suffocating heat, his skin blistering as he followed the rhythmic twitch of the rat's tail. He reached the back corner, where the stone foundation met the earth. Behind a stack of rotting cedar planks, he felt it, a thin, freezing stream of air. He kicked at the masonry with desperate strength. The mortar, weakened by decades of dampness, gave way. He tumbled through the hole just as the floorboards above him collapsed in a roar of sparks. He fell into a narrow, damp tunnel that smelled of wet clay and old bones. It was an old smuggler's run, forgotten by the villagers but remembered by the small folk of the earth. As he crawled, the sound of the fire faded, replaced by the steady drip-drip of water. "The water vein is close," the rat whispered, its voice echoing in the tunnel. "But the Cold Eye Man has set the metal traps at the well's mouth. He knows all the holes, Walker. Why help me?" Silas panted, his hands raw and bleeding. "Because the Cold Eye Man kills for sport. He kills the bird on the branch and leaves it to rot. You kill only to eat. The balance needs the hunter, not the butcher." Silas emerged at the base of the village well, hidden by the internal stone lip. He looked up the long shaft of the well and saw the stars, and the silhouette of a guard looking down. The second bell began to toll. Bong! The vibration of the bell shook the very stones of the well. This was it. The signal for the assassins to take their positions. Silas gripped the mossy stones, his muscles screaming. He had no weapons, his bow was lost in the fire, but he had something Herrick could never anticipate. He had the eyes and ears of every living thing in Oakhaven. "He is coming up the throat," a toad croaked from a crevice near the guard's feet. "The wet man comes." Silas lunged upward, his fingers catching the bucket rope. He had to reach Ilara before the second bell finished its echoes. The poisoned manor. The second toll of the bell was still vibrating in the cold night air when Silas hauled himself over the lip of the well. He was a spectre of soot and wet clay, his lungs burning. The guard who had been peering down was slumped against a stone post, distracted by the towering inferno of the grain house. "Look away, Metal Skin! Look at the red flower in the sky!" An owl hooted from the manor's rafters. The guard obeyed the primal urge to watch the fire, giving Silas the heartbeat he needed to slip into the shadows of the chief's garden. He reached the heavy oak doors of the manor. They were barred from the inside, a sign that the protection Herrick promised was actually a siege. Silas scaled the ivy-covered trellis, his fingers trembling as he reached the balcony of Ilara's chambers. Inside, the room smelled of lavender and medicinal herbs. Ilara sat by her father's bedside, her face pale and etched with exhaustion. The chief lay motionless, his skin a sickly, translucent gray. "Silas!" Ilara gasped, springing up as the charred hunter tumbled through the window. "Guards! Help!" "Don't!" Silas wheezed, holding up a hand. "Ilara, it's Herrick. The grain-house fire, it was a distraction. He has crossbows hidden. He's poisoned your father." Ilara's eyes flashed with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Herrick is the captain of the guard. He's been out there all night protecting us from whatever is lurking in the woods. You look like a madman, Silas." "The glass. The glass on the table." A caged canary chirped frantically from the corner of the room. Its wings beat against the wire in a rhythmic panic. "The bitter water is in the blue glass." The man with the cold eyes poured the sleep death while the girl wept. Silas pointed to a small, blue vial sitting on the nightstand. "Did Herrick give him that? To ease his pain?" "Yes," Ilara whispered. "He said it was a tincture from the village healer." "It's hemlock," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent growl. "Ask the bird, Ilara. Ask the world. They all know." "You're talking nonsense," she said, but her hand drifted toward the vial. Suddenly, the heavy door to the chambers groaned. The iron bolt slid back with a sickening scrape. "The predator comes. The one who smells of whetstones." A mouse scurried under Ilara's bed, its voice a needle-thin prick of terror in Silas's mind. Herrick stepped into the room. He didn't look like a protector anymore. He carried a heavy, black steel crossbow, already cocked. Behind him stood two guards with their visors down, their blades drawn and stained with fresh, dark blood. "I told you the hunter was dangerous, Ilara," Herrick said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Look at him, covered in the soot of the grain house he just burned down. He's lost his mind to the shadows of the veil. Step away from him." Silas looked at the canary. Then he looked at Herrick. The Queen's gift wasn't just for hearing, it was for knowing. He could see the micro-twitches in Herrick's jaw, the way the man's pulse throbbed in his neck. Herrick wasn't just a traitor, he was a man who enjoyed the hunt. The orchestrated ruin. The air in the bedchamber turned frigid as Herrick stepped further into the light. The flickering candles cast his shadow against the wall, making him look like a gargantuan predator. He leveled the heavy crossbow at Silas's chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "He murdered the guards at the grain house, Ilara," Herrick lied, his voice a masterclass in feigned grief. "He's been tainted by the forbidden veil. Look at his eyes. There is a madness there that no medicine can cure." Ilara looked between the soot-stained hunter and the polished captain. Her hand trembled near the blue vial. "Silas, is it true? Did you start the fire?" "The liar breathes like a snake," the canary shrieked, its wings battering the brass bars of its cage. "The steel man smells of the hemlock. He carries the death drops in his glove." Silas didn't look at Ilara. He looked at the shadows beneath the wardrobe. "Herrick, you have the poison on your left glove. The scent of the root is thick on you. The birds saw you. The mice saw you. The very dust of this house is screaming your name." Herrick's eyes narrowed into slits of ice. The pretense was slipping. "Talking to birds now. You see, Ilara, the Queen's touch has rotted his brain." "Kill him," he commanded the guards. As the two men lunged forward, Silas let out a low, piercing whistle, a sound he didn't know he could make until the Queen touched his ears. It was a frequency of pure, primal command. Suddenly, the manor erupted. The caged canary threw itself against the latch of its door with such violence the small hook popped. It dived at the first guard's face, a blur of yellow feathers and pecking beak. At the same moment, dozens of rats, drawn from the walls by Silas's call, swarmed from beneath the bed and wardrobe. They didn't bite. They simply became a carpet of moving fur beneath the guard's boots. One guard slipped, his heavy armor clattering as he crashed into a wash-basin. "Witchcraft!" Herrick bellowed, swinging the crossbow toward the chaotic swarm. "The heavy wood falls." "Duck, Walker!" A spider dropped from the canopy of the bed, its voice a tiny needle of warning. Silas dived behind a heavy oak chair just as Herrick pulled the trigger. The iron bolt thudded into the wood with enough force to splinter it. Silas didn't wait for a second shot. He grabbed Ilara's hand, pulling her toward the balcony. "We have to go. If we stay, he'll kill us both and blame the beast of the woods." "But my father," Ilara cried, looking back at the unconscious chief. "The sleeper is not dead. The root only binds the limbs." A mouse squeaked from the hem of her dress. "He's alive, Ilara. But he won't stay that way if Herrick takes the throne." Silas vaulted over the stone railing, pulling her with him into the tangled ivy. Below them, the village was waking up to the fire at the grain house. The screaming of the animals was reaching a fever pitch. To the villagers, it was the sound of a cursed night. To Silas, it was a map of every guard's position in the dark. Into the maw of the veil. The night air was a cold blade against Silas's soot-stained skin as he and Ilara hit the garden soil. Behind them, the manor erupted in shouts. Herrick's silhouette appeared on the balcony, his crossbow a dark finger pointing into the mist. "To the woods!" Silas hissed, pulling Ilara toward the perimeter fence. "The forbidden veil!" Ilara's voice caught in her throat. "Silas, no one returns from there after dark. The legends say the trees themselves have teeth. The iron teeth follow. The metal skins bring the fire sticks." A stray cat hissed from atop the stone wall, its green eyes glowing like embers. "The path to the weeping willow is clear. Run, Walker, before the scent of your fear fills the valley." Silas didn't argue. He could hear the heavy rhythmic clank of armored boots. Herrick's elite guard was closing the circle. They moved with the grim efficiency of men who had already decided their victims' fates. They broke into a sprint, leaving the flickering orange glow of the burning grain house behind. As they crossed the threshold of the great oaks, the sounds of the village, the bells, the shouting, the crackle of flame, died instantly. It was replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like water. The forbidden veil was alive. The trees here didn't grow straight, they twisted like limbs in agony. The mist was thick, tasting of copper and ancient rot. "Silas, I can't see the path," Ilara whispered, clutching his arm. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. "Left turn. Over the bone root." A raven croaked from a branch so low it brushed Silas's hair. "The Queen's shadow lingers where the water bleeds red." "Trust me," Silas said, guiding her over a massive, gnarled root that looked uncomfortably like a ribcage. Behind them, A torch flickered. Herrick hadn't stopped. He was driven by a desperation that outweighed his fear of the spirits. "Find them," his voice echoed, distorted by the fog. "Bring me the girl alive. The hunter is to be gutted on sight." Silas stopped near a pool of stagnant, rust-colored water. The air here vibrated with a low hum. "The Queen's gift is a debt, Silas of Oakhaven," a voice sighed, not from a bird or a beast, but from the very wind itself. Suddenly, a massive shape stepped from the gloom. It was a stag, but its antlers were made of white bone and draped in weeping moss. Its eyes were not golden like the hind's, they were pits of starlight. Elara shrieked, falling to her knees. "The Guardian!" The stag lowered its head, its breath smelling of winter frost. "The child of the sun brings a heart of lead," the stag's voice vibrated in Silas's skull. "The king who sleeps needs the heart-root. It grows in the throat of the sunken hollow. But the price of the cure is a secret you must leave behind." Silas looked back. Herrick's torches were closer now, the orange light reflecting off the mist like a predator's eyes. "I'll pay whatever price is asked," Silas vowed, his hand tightening on the hilt of his hunting knife. "Just tell me how to save the chief. The secret is not yours to give, hunter. It is hers." The stag turned its gaze to Elara, the debt of kings. The sunken hollow was a wound in the earth, a deep limestone basin where the mist pooled like stagnant milk. At its center grew a tree with translucent, pulsing roots, the heart-root. Its leaves hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that made Silas's teeth ache. The bone stag stood at the edge, its starlight eyes fixed on Elara. "The cure for the blood of a king is the truth of a king," the stag's voice echoed. "To pluck the root, the child must confess the sin that built the stone nest of Oakhaven." Behind them, the crashing of brush grew louder. Herrick had reached the hollow's rim. "Silas! Elara!" His voice boomed, jagged with triumph. "There is no escape from the veil. Surrender the girl, and I might give you a quick death." "Silas, stay back!" Elara cried, her face pale as she stepped toward the pulsing tree. "I'll hold them," Silas growled. He had no bow, but he had the forest. He whistled a sharp, low note. "The stingers wake. The golden bellies rise." A swarm of ground wasps hummed from beneath a nearby log. "Tell us where to bite, Walker." "The men with the fire sticks," Silas commanded. "Drive them back." As the first of Herrick's guards crested the ridge, a golden cloud of fury erupted from the leaf litter. Screams echoed through the trees as the wasps swarmed the gaps in their armor. Herrick cursed, swinging his torch wildly, but the distraction gave Elara the moment she needed. She knelt at the base of the heart-root. "My father, he didn't build Oakhaven on peace," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The scrolls in the secret cellar. They say he drove the forest folk out with iron and flame 40 years ago. He stole the land from the Queen's children. That is why the Vale hates us. That is why he is dying. The land is taking back its due." The bone stag bowed its heavy head. "The debt is acknowledged. The blood is tainted, but the heart is honest." With a shimmering snap, a single glowing root severed itself and curled into Elara's palm. It felt warm, like a living pulse. "I have it!" she shouted. But the victory was short-lived. A heavy bolt whistled through the air, narrowly missing Silas's shoulder and thudding into the heart-root tree. Herrick had broken through the wasp swarm, his face swollen and distorted by stings, his eyes burning with a murderous light. "The root!" Herrick bellowed. "Give it to me, girl. With that power, I won't just rule Oakhaven, I'll rule the Vale itself." The Cold-Eye Man seeks the throne of shadows, a crow cawed from above. He will feast on the rot he creates. Silas stepped between Herrick and Elara, his hunting knife drawn. He was exhausted, bleeding, and outnumbered, but the forest was no longer a silent witness. It was an audience. The hollow's reckoning. The sunken hollow became a theater of shadows. Herrick discarded his spent crossbow, drawing a long sword that shimmered with a cruel, polished light. Silas felt the weight of his small hunting knife, a tool for skinning rabbits, not for dueling a master of the blade. "You're a scavenger, Silas," Herrick sneered, circling the hunter. "A man who talks to vermin and hides in the dirt. You think the Queen's parlor tricks can stop steel? The ground is hungry." "The belly of the earth is soft," a mole whispered from beneath a mound of moss near Herrick's heel. Silas didn't blink. He lowered his center of gravity, his ears tuning out Herrick's insults to hear the symphony of the hollow. He heard the vibration of a heavy branch overhead, weakened by rot. He heard the scurrying of 1,000 beetles beneath the leaf litter. "The trees remember what your kind did, Herrick," Silas said, his voice a low vibration. "They remember the fire. They remember the blood. And they're tired of waiting for justice." Herrick lunged. His sword whistled through the air, a silver arc aimed at Silas's throat. Silas ducked, the blade shearing a lock of his soot-stained hair. He rolled through the muck, his fingers brushing against the exposed root of an ancient cedar. "Pull, Walker! Pull the thread!" a squirrel chattered from the high canopy. Silas gripped a trailing vine and yanked with all his strength. High above, the rotting branch, gnawed thin by wood-boring beetles at Silas's silent command, snapped. It crashed down, a ton of dead oak hurtling toward the captain. Herrick leaped back, barely avoiding being crushed, but the impact sent a shockwave through the unstable limestone floor. The ground beneath his heavy, armored boots groaned. "Witchcraft!" Herrick bellowed, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He scrambled for footing, but the insects were already moving. "The silver crawler! Bind the metal skin!" Thousands of spiders hissed in unison. From the crevices of the rocks, thick, sticky webs began to drift like winter snow, caught in the localized draft Silas had summoned with a sharp whistle. The silk clung to Herrick's armor, gumming up the joints of his gauntlets and sticking his sword to its scabbard. "Ilara, run!" Silas shouted, seeing his opening. "Get the route to the village. I'll finish this." "I won't leave you," she cried, but the bone stag stepped between her and the duel, its starlight eyes pointing toward the forest path. "The king fades, child of sun," the stag's voice resonated. "The hunter's debt is his own to settle." Herrick hacked at the webs, his movements becoming sluggish and frantic. He looked like a fly caught in a cosmic web. "I'll burn this whole forest to the ground," he screamed, reaching for a fire-starter in his belt. "I'll kill every bird, every beast." Silas stepped forward, his hunting knife reflecting the pulsing light of the heartroot. "The forest heard you, Herrick, and it doesn't like threats." Suddenly, the earth gave way. The limestone crust, hollowed out by centuries of water and the recent tremors, collapsed into a dark, jagged maw directly beneath Herrick's feet. The mouth of the earth. The scream that tore from Herrick's throat was cut short by a sickening crunch. As the limestone shelf disintegrated, a pair of massive, calcified pale limbs, resembling tree roots but moving with the fluid hunger of a spider, shot out from the darkness of the pit. They coiled around Herrick's armored waist, dragging him into the black maw of the sunken hollow. "No. I am the king. I am." His voice vanished into the depths, followed by the distant, wet sound of something very old and very large settling back into its slumber. The silence that followed was deafening. The spiders retreated into the cracks, the wasps vanished into the earth. Silas stood at the edge of the new crater, his chest heaving. The gift in his ears hummed a low, mournful dirge. "The rot is buried," 1,000 tiny voices whispered from the soil. "The soil will turn the metal into rust and the hate into bone." "Silas!" Ilara's voice broke the trance. She was standing by the bone stag, the glowing heartroot clutched to her chest. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the canopy of the forbidden veil. "The sun, we're running out of time." Silas turned, his eyes meeting the bone stag's starlight gaze. The creature bowed, its mossy antlers brushing the forest floor. "The debt is paid in blood and truth, Walker. Go. The forest will part for the merciful." They ran. This time, the trees did not trip them. The thorns pulled back like curtain lace, and the mist curled away to reveal a path of silver moss. Silas felt the forest cheering them on, the rhythmic thumping of rabbit paws against the earth, the frantic, encouraging chirps of the morning birds. "Run, featherless. The king's breath is a flickering candle. Run." As they burst from the tree line, Oakhaven appeared below them. The grain house was a smoldering black skeleton, and the village square was filled with Herrick's remaining men, their crossbows leveled at the frightened villagers. They were looking for their leader, unaware he had been claimed by the earth. "We can't go through the main gate," Silas panted, pointing to the line of steel. "The cellar." "The root cellar under the kitchen." A ginger tabby cat yowled from a nearby hayloft. "The heavy man left the trapdoor unbolted when he stole the milk." Silas grabbed Ilara's hand. "Follow the cat." They skirted the stone walls, moving through the shadows of the pigsties and tool sheds. The cat led them with a flick of its tail, weaving through narrow gaps that no human would have noticed. They reached the manor's rear just as the village bell struck the hour of dawn, the time Herrick had set for the passing of the chief. Inside the manor, the air was cold. The guards in the hallway were distracted, arguing about Herrick's disappearance. Silas and Ilara slipped into the chief's chambers. He looked like a marble statue, his skin blue-gray, his breath so shallow it didn't even stir the air. "The root," Silas whispered. "Quickly." Ilara pressed the pulsing heart-root against her father's lips. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, the root began to dissolve, turning into a liquid gold that flowed into the chief's mouth. The king's roar. The golden liquid of the heart-root did not just slide down the chief's throat, it ignited. For a heartbeat, his entire ribcage glowed with a soft, amber light, as if a guttering candle had suddenly been fed a gust of pure oxygen. His eyes snapped open, not the dull, clouded gray of a dying man, but a sharp, piercing blue that seemed to hold the clarity of the morning sky. "Ilara," the chief wheezed, his voice like grinding stones. "Father." "Don't move," she cried, tears finally breaking through her exhaustion. But the chief was already sitting up, the poison's paralysis shattered by the forest's magic. He looked at Silas, charred, bleeding, and smelling of the forbidden veil. "The hunter," the chief rumbled. I saw the bone stag in the grey mists. He said a man of mercy had paid my ransom." Outside, the village square erupted. "Herrick is gone. The chief is dead. Secure the hall," a sergeant bellowed. The heavy thud of boots and the clatter of crossbows against stone echoed through the manor walls. "The metal stings are ready. They point at the stone houses." The canary shrieked from its broken cage, hopping frantically on the windowsill. "They will bite the little walkers. They will bite the milk mothers." Silas turned to the window. Herrick's loyalists, fearing a riot now that their leader was missing, were leveling their poisoned crossbows at the gathered villagers in the square. The tension was a cord stretched to the snapping point. "They think they've won because they have the steel," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum. "They've forgotten that we live in a world that breathes." He stepped onto the balcony, the chief and Ilara behind him. The guards below froze, their mouths agape at the sight of the dead ruler standing tall. "Lower your weapons," the chief roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls of Oakhaven. "He's a ghost." "A trick of the hunter," the sergeant yelled, raising his crossbow toward the balcony. "Fire!" Silas didn't flinch. He let out a long, piercing whistle that carried the weight of the Queen's gift. It wasn't a call for help, it was an eviction notice. Suddenly, the square became a whirlwind of fur and feather. "Bite the wood! Snap the strings!" Hundreds of rats surged from the gutters, swarming the guards' boots not to kill, but to chew. The tension strings of the crossbows, made of organic gut and hemp, became targets for 1,000 tiny teeth. Snap! Twang! Snap! One by one, the forbidden weapons became useless sticks in the guards' hands. Simultaneously, every hound in the village, led by Old Blue, broke their tethers. They didn't bark, they growled with a low, primal frequency that vibrated in the guards' marrow. "The animals!" The sergeant stammered, backing away as a massive murder of crows descended from the sky, a black cloud that blotted out the rising sun. They didn't attack, they simply perched on every roof, every ledge, every shoulder, thousands of unblinking black eyes judging the men below. "The balance returns," the crows cawed in a singular, deafening voice that Silas translated for the entire square. "The butcher is gone. The hunter remains." The guards dropped their broken bows. The villagers, seeing their chief alive and the very earth rising against their oppressors, surged forward. The coup was over not with a massacre, but with a surrender to the overwhelming will of the living world. The price of the silence. The fires of the grain-house were now nothing but white ash and memory. In the square, the villagers began the slow, rhythmic work of clearing the debris. The air, once thick with the metallic tang of fear and the bitter scent of hemlock, had cleared. But for Silas, the world was louder than it had ever been. He stood on the edge of the clearing, watching the chief and Ilara distribute the last of the salted meat from the manor's private larder. To anyone else, the village was returning to peace. To Silas, it was a cacophony of 1,000 souls. "The stone is heavy. My back is breaking," a donkey brayed near the well. "The grain is gone. We will starve by the first frost," the mice shrieked from the charred ruins. "The hunter is cursed. He smells of the queen," the crows croaked from the rafters. Silas clutched his head, his knuckles white. The gift was no longer a tool, it was an avalanche. He could hear the hunger of the spiders in the walls and the ancient, slow thoughts of the moss growing on the stones. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, the dreams of the animals, vivid, primal, and terrifying, flooded his mind. "Silas!" Ilara's voice was a soft anchor in the storm. She stepped toward him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and growing concern. "You haven't eaten. You look like a man who is being hunted by his own shadow." "I'm fine, Ilara," he lied, his voice rasping. "He lies. The walker's brain is boiling." A tabby cat meowed as it rubbed against Ilara's skirt. "He hears the heartbeat of the earth, and it is too fast for a soft skin." Silas flinched, pulling away from her. "It's the woods. I need to go back." "Back to the Vale," she gasped. "The chief wants to name you the new captain. He wants to build a monument to the hunter who saved the crown." "The crown was saved by the Queen's mercy, not my bow," Silas said, looking toward the dark, jagged line of the forbidden veil. "The gift she gave me, it wasn't meant for a village square. It was meant for the silence of the deep woods." Suddenly, the air turned cold. A single, black feather drifted down from a cloudless sky, landing on Silas's palm. It didn't feel like a feather, it felt like a shard of ice. "The debt is never fully paid, Silas of Oakhaven," the Queen's voice echoed in his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. "The language of the wild cannot live in a house of stone. To keep the gift, you must become part of the gift." Silas looked at Ilara, then at the bustling, noisy village he had called home for 30 years. He realized then that he could no longer be a man of Oakhaven. He was the bridge between the world of men and the world of the wild. If he stayed, the constant screaming of the village's domestic animals, their small, petty fears and hunger, would drive him to madness. "I can't stay, Ilara," he whispered. "The animals, they tell me things. The grain-house fire was just the beginning. The winter will be harder than any we've seen. I need to be in the woods to lead the game back to the valley. I need to be the voice for the things that cannot speak." "You're leaving us." Tears welled in her eyes. "She will weep for 7 sons, then she will lead," a robin chirped from a nearby branch. "The hunter goes to the queen. The hunter goes to the dark." The seeping gloom. The boundary of the forbidden veil felt different this time. It didn't push Silas away with a sense of dread, it pulled at him like a familiar, cold embrace. As he stepped over the threshold of the great oaks, the frantic chatter of the village, the bleating of terrified sheep and the gossip of sparrows, faded into a singular, deep hum. But the hum was off-key. It vibrated with a jagged, oily resonance. "The skin creepers. They come from the low dark," a chorus of tree frogs croaked from a nearby marsh. Their voices were frantic, a staccato of terror that made the hair on Silas's neck stand up. "The Queen's gate is cracked. The shadow hounds are loose." Silas drew his new knife, a gift from the chief forged from blackened steel. "Where?" he whispered to the air. "The throat of the valley, where the water turns to ink." A hawk screamed as it circled a patch of forest that seemed unnaturally dark, even for the vale. Silas moved toward the sound. The air grew thick, smelling not of damp earth, but of sulfur and old, stagnant blood. In a clearing where the queen had first appeared to him, the ground was no longer covered in moss. A dark, viscous liquid was bubbling up from the roots of a dying willow, spreading like a bruise across the forest floor. From the center of the pool, a creature hauled itself out. It looked like a wolf, but its skin was translucent, stretched tight over bones made of obsidian. It had no eyes, only 2 pits of swirling purple smoke. "Hunger, so much hunger," the creature hissed. It wasn't a voice Silas recognized. It didn't sound like the animals of the earth. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. The queen sleeps in her silver bed, and the gate is left unguarded. We shall feast on the warm bloods. Silas felt a surge of cold fury. The queen had given him this gift to maintain the balance, and now the balance was being tipped by the very realm she ruled. Not while I breathe, Silas growled. Suddenly, another shadow hound lunged from the brush behind him. Left leap. The shadow bite is high, a field mouse squeaked from the safety of a hollow log. Silas dived to the left, the creature's teeth snapping inches from his ear. The air where it passed felt like a blast of winter frost, numbing his skin. He realized then that his steel knife wouldn't be enough. To fight the shadows, he needed the forest to provide more than just directions. "All of you!" Silas shouted, his voice a command that shook the leaves. "The hunters of the night! The stingers! The biters! If these things cross the veil, there will be no forest left to call home." The forest went silent for a heartbeat. Then, the ground began to tremble. The wild's vengeance. The clearing erupted in a symphony of primal fury. Silas stood at the center, his blackened steel knife catching the sickly purple light of the shadowhounds. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was the conductor of a lethal orchestra. "The forest answers. The blood pulse calls," a great grizzly roared, its voice vibrating in Silas's chest like a mountain collapsing. The massive beast burst through the thicket, its fur matted with pine needles and ancient rage. Behind it, a pack of timber wolves flowed through the undergrowth like gray smoke, their eyes fixed on the obsidian bones of the invaders. "Strike the throat," Silas commanded, his voice amplified by the queen's gift. "Their hearts are the smoke in their chests." The first shadowhound lunged, a blur of translucent flesh and void. But before it could reach Silas, a streak of gold and brown plummeted from the canopy. A pair of mountain eagles dived, their talons raking through the creature's smoky eye pits. The hound shrieked, a sound like glass shattering, and stumbled. "Now, Walker! Bite the cold heart!" the lead wolf snarled, leaping onto the hound's back. Silas didn't hesitate. He drove his knife into the center of the creature's ribs. As the steel pierced the smoke, a wave of freezing energy washed over him, turning his breath to ice. The hound dissolved into a puddle of oily ink, leaving nothing behind but the smell of sulfur. But the pool beneath the willow was widening. 3 more hounds hauled themselves into the moonlight, their obsidian bones clicking with a rhythmic, predatory hunger. "The gate leak! The black water is the key!" a colony of bats shrieked, swirling in a dizzying cloud above the pool. "Drown the dark with the earth! Seal the throat with the ancient stones!" Silas looked at the great grizzly. "The stones, old one! The limestone shelf by the creek." The bear understood. With a grunt of immense effort, it threw its weight against a massive, moss-covered boulder at the edge of the clearing. The wolves joined in, digging at the soft earth beneath the stone with frantic paws. Silas turned to face the remaining hounds, his knife raised. He was the shield for the forest's labor. One hound snapped at his leg, its teeth leaving a trail of frostburn on his leather boots. "You don't belong here," Silas roared, his voice merging with the growls of the pack. With a final, earth-shaking heave, the grizzly sent the boulder crashing into the bubbling pool. The impact was deafening. The dark liquid sprayed into the air, hissing as it touched the limestone. The boulder settled deep into the throat of the valley, pinning the willow's roots and severing the connection to the low dark. The remaining hounds let out a final, hollow wail as their forms began to flicker and fade. Without the seep of the underworld to sustain them, they could not survive the air of the living. Within seconds, they evaporated into nothingness. Silence returned to the clearing, but it was a weary, wounded silence. The grizzly slumped against the boulder, its breath ragged. The wolves circled Silas, their tails low in a gesture of grim respect. "The leak is plugged, Walker," the lead wolf whispered. "But the Queen's Gate is old. The hinges are rusted with the sins of the stone nest. This was but a breath. The storm is still coming." Silas looked at his hands. They were stained with the black ink of the hounds, a stain that wouldn't wash away. He was deeper into the veil than any human had ever been, and he could feel the weight of the crown he never asked for. The mirror pool's reflection. The mirror pool lay at the very heart of the forbidden vale, a place where the water did not ripple even if a stone were cast into its center. It was a silver pane of glass that reflected not the sky above, but a sky of violet stars and obsidian clouds. Silas knelt at its edge, the black stain on his hands pulsing with a cold, rhythmic light. "The walker seeks the deep mother," the dragonflies hummed, their wings shimmering like iridescent needles. "He brings the scent of the void on his skin. He brings the questions that have no breath. I seek the queen." Silas roared, his voice cracking the unnatural silence of the pool. "The gate is broken. Your hounds are bleeding into our world." The water did not splash, it dissolved. From the center of the silver circle, a figure rose. It was the queen of the Underworld, but she was not the radiant, terrifying beauty Silas had met in the mist. Her robes of woven shadow were frayed, and her pale skin was translucent, showing the faint, flickering pulse of her heart like a dying ember. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a hollow wind, "you have come to find a culprit, but you find only a prisoner." Silas recoiled. "A prisoner? You are the queen of the dead. The crown is heavy." "The crown is a cage." A snowy owl perched on a nearby white oak hooted, its voice thick with a mourning Silas hadn't heard before. The queen stepped onto the surface of the water, her feet leaving glowing white footprints. "The balance of the veil is tied to the balance of the throne. When the king of Oakhaven stole the land and built his stone nest with blood and iron, he didn't just hurt the forest. He cracked the foundation of the world beneath. The heart root." Silas realized, his hand going to his chest. "We used it to save him. Did we make it worse?" "You saved a life, but you did not pay the debt of the land," the queen said, her eyes swirling with a dark, liquid grief. "The Shadowhounds are the manifestation of that unpaid debt. They are the hunger of the earth for what was taken. My power is fading because the land no longer recognizes its masters. I cannot hold the gate if the world above is a lie. The lie is the stone. The truth is the root." A chorus of cicadas buzzed, a deafening vibration that made Silas's vision swim. Suddenly, the pool began to boil. Not with heat, but with a frantic, thrashing energy. A massive, skeletal hand, 3 times the size of a man's, erupted from the silver water, clutching at the queen's robes. "They are coming for the source," the queen gasped, her form flickering. "If they take me, the veil falls. Oakhaven will be the first to be swallowed by the eternal night." Silas lunged forward, his blackened knife glowing with a sudden, fierce intensity. "What do I have to do?" "The debt must be settled," the queen cried as she was pulled downward. "The stone nest must return what it stole. You are the bridge, Silas. You must choose between the life you saved and the world that sustains it." The water surged, a tidal wave of silver and shadow that knocked Silas backward. When he wiped the stinging spray from his eyes, the pool was empty. The queen was gone, dragged into the low dark, and the forest around him began to wilt, the leaves turning to ash in a heartbeat. The weight of the stone. Silas burst from the tree line of the forbidden vale, but the forest didn't recognize him as its protector anymore. The trees were shriveled, their leaves hanging like charred parchment. The air was thick with a cloying, metallic taste. As he raced toward Oakhaven, he saw the shadows stretching, not away from the sun, but toward the village like reaching fingers. The village square was a scene of frantic activity. The chief stood on the stone dais, directing the repair of the grain house, his face full of newfound vigor. Ilara was at his side, her eyes bright with hope. When she saw Silas stumbling toward them, his hands blackened and his clothes torn, her smile vanished. "Silas, what happened?" "The woods, they look like they're dying," she cried, rushing to meet him. "It's not just the woods, Ilara," Silas wheezed, his heart hammering. He turned to the chief, whose expression hardened. "The queen is gone. She was dragged into the low dark because the debt of this land remains unpaid." The chief stepped down from the dais, his boots clicking sharply on the cobblestones. "I am alive, Silas. The heartroot saved me. The village is rebuilding. What debt could possibly remain?" "The stolen earth! The buried screams!" A mangy hound howled from the shadows of the well. "The stone nest sits on the ribs of the forest folk." Silas pointed his blackened knife at the ground. "This village, Oakhaven, It was built on a massacre. You drove the spirits and the forest folk out with iron and fire 40 years ago. The heartroot was a temporary bandage, but the wound is festering. The underworld is rising to reclaim what was stolen. The chief's face went pale, the gold in his eyes flickering. I did what I had to for my people to survive. We cannot simply leave. Then you will be consumed, Silas roared, his voice suddenly layered with the growls of 1,000 unseen wolves. The queen said the stone nest must return what it took. The walls, the great hall, the paved square, they are the chains holding the gate open. To save the world, Oakhaven must fall. A murmur of horror rippled through the gathered villagers. They looked at their sturdy homes, the walls that had protected them for generations. You're asking us to destroy our lives, a woman cried, clutching her child. The dark water is at the gate. The shadowhounds smell the milk, the crows shrieked from the rooftops, their voices a jagged chorus of doom. As if on cue, the ground in the center of the square groaned. A hairline fracture appeared in the cobblestones, and a thin, purple mist began to seep through the cracks. The temperature plummeted. The first shadowhound had found the village. It's starting, Silas whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Chief, you have an hour. Either we dismantle the heart of this village and return the land to the wild, or the wild will come and take it, along with every soul inside. Ilara looked at her father, then at the spreading purple stain in the square. Father, the scrolls. Silas is right. The foundation is rotten. The chief looked at his daughter, then at his people. He saw the fear in their eyes, and for the first time, he saw the arrogance of the stone walls he had cherished. The unmaking of Oakhaven. The air in the square turned to ice as the first shadowhound's obsidian claws scraped against the cobblestones. It was larger than the ones in the vale, its body pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly violet light. More began to pull themselves from the widening fissures, their empty eye sockets fixed on the terrified villagers. "Tear it down!" the chief roared, his voice breaking with grief. "Every stone from the great hall, every timber of the gate. Give the earth back its breath." The villagers moved with a desperate, frantic energy. Men and women who had spent their lives building walls were now swinging sledgehammers against them. Stones that had stood for 40 years were pried loose, the mortar crumbling like bone dust. The stone nest breaks. The air returns, the swallows shrieked, diving in frantic circles above the workers. But the hungry ones are inside the fence. The hungry ones smell the warm blood. Silas stood at the center of the square, his blackened knife held tight. Beside him, Old Blue the hound stood with fur bristling, and a dozen stray cats hissed from the low walls. "Hold the circle," Silas commanded. A shadowhound lunged at a young girl carrying a basket of thatch. Silas whistled, a sharp, piercing note that vibrated through the stone. From the shadows of a nearby stable, a massive plow horse reared up, its hooves striking the hound with the force of a falling mountain. The creature let out a hollow wail and dissipated into mist. "Good boy," Silas shouted. But for every hound that fell, 2 more emerged from the cracks. The ground beneath Oakhaven was becoming a sieve for the underworld. "The water vein. The well," a toad croaked from the garden. "The deep dark is climbing the bucket rope." Silas looked at Ilara, who was leading a group of elders toward the forest edge. "Get them to the high ground. Don't look back." "Silas, the great hall isn't coming down fast enough," she cried, pointing to the massive timber structure that represented the village's pride. It sat directly over the main fracture. Silas looked at the great hall. It was the heart of the stone nest. As long as its weight pressed down on the wounded earth, the gate could not close. "Chief, the main pillar," Silas yelled. The chief grabbed a heavy woodsman's axe, his muscles bulging as the heartroot's gold flickered in his veins. He struck the ancient oak pillar with the strength of 10 men. With a deafening groan, the hall began to tilt. Suddenly, a massive, skeletal hand, the same one that had taken the queen, erupted from the center of the hall's floorboards. It grabbed the chief's ankle, dragging him toward the abyss. "Father!" Ilara screamed. Silas didn't think. He charged into the collapsing building, his ears filled with the collective roar of every animal in the valley. "Strike the wrist! Strike the bone stone!" the rats hissed from the rafters. Silas dived, his blackened knife glowing white-hot as he drove it into the spectral hand. A shock-wave of cold energy threw him backward, but the grip loosened. The chief scrambled free just as the great hall collapsed in a thunderous roar of dust and splintering wood. The weight was gone. The earth let out a long, shuddering sigh. The gauntlet of ghosts. The collapse of the great hall didn't just bring down timber, it tore the vale wide. A geyser of violet energy erupted from the ruins, spiraling into the sky like a bruised cyclone. The shock-wave knocked the villagers to their knees, and for a moment the world went silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that tasted of ancient copper. The deep breathers are awake. The kings of the silt are rising. The moles shrieked from beneath the churning soil. Run to the high roots. Run to where the sunstones sleep. To the ridge. Silas roared, his voice cutting through the panic. Leave the gold. Leave the steel. Only your lives matter now. The villagers scrambled toward the northern slope, a ragged line of survivors silhouetted against the unnatural glow of their dying home. But the shadows weren't letting go. From the wreckage of the houses, the discarded stones began to move. They didn't roll, they hopped and skittered like jagged gray insects, possessed by the spirits of the low dark. A wall of animated masonry rose in front of the elders, cutting off the path to the forest. The stone biters! Aim for the moss eyes! A hawk screamed, diving from the swirling storm to strike at a glowing green vein in one of the moving rocks. Silas sprinted to the front of the line. Ilara, take the chief. Don't stop until you hit the silver oaks. Silas, the stones, they're surrounding us, she cried, clutching her father, whose strength was finally beginning to fail as the heartroot's light dimmed. Silas looked at the mountain of vengeful rock. He whistled, not a command this time, but a plea. Suddenly, the ground beneath the stone monsters erupted. A massive colony of badgers and forest hogs, led by the great grizzly from the vale, burst through the earth. They didn't attack the stones with teeth, they dug beneath them, undermining the very ground the spirits used for leverage. Topple the heavy walkers! Return them to the dirt! The grizzly roared, its fur smoking with the frost of the shadow realm. As the stone wall crumbled into the pits dug by the animals, Silas saw his opening. Go! Now! They ran a gauntlet of nightmares. Shadowhounds nipped at their heels, only to be intercepted by the village dogs who fought with a ferocity that defied their size. Crows formed a living shield above them, their wings buffeting the purple mist that tried to choke the breath from the children's lungs. Almost there, Walker! The silver oaks breathed the light! The robin from the garden chirped, its small heart drumming against Silas's shoulder. As the first villager crossed the threshold of the high vale, a grove of ancient trees that had never been touched by the chief's axes, the purple tide hit an invisible wall. The silver leaves shimmered, emitting a soft, rhythmic hum that acted like poison to the shadows. One by one, the people of Oakhaven collapsed onto the sacred moss, gasping for air. Silas stood at the edge, his blackened knife shaking in his hand. He looked back at the valley. Oakhaven was gone. In its place was a roiling lake of violet smoke and broken stone. The stone nest had been reclaimed. But as he watched, a familiar figure began to take shape in the center of the storm, the living anchor. The violet cyclone over the ruins of Oakhaven began to collapse inward, drawing the shadows back into the throat of the earth. From the center of the swirling debris, the queen of the underworld rose once more. She was no longer the fading ember Silas had seen in the mirror pool. She was draped in a mantle of starlight and wet earth, her eyes twin voids of absolute authority. The villagers shrank back into the silver moss of the high vale, their breath hitching. Even the animals went silent, the wolves bowed their heads, and the crows folded their wings in a gesture of profound submission. The stone nest is unmade. The queen's voice vibrated through the very marrow of Silas's bones. The debt of the land is paid in rubble and salt. But the gate has been forced too wide. It will not close with only silence. Silas stepped forward, his boots crunching on the sacred silver leaves. You said the debt was settled. The village is gone. What more do you want? The hinge. The hinge needs a hand. A black snake hissed from the roots of a silver oak. A gate without a keeper is just an open door. The queen turned her gaze toward the chief, who lay pale and trembling in Ilara's arms. The golden light of the heartroot in his veins was nearly extinguished. The king who broke the land cannot be the one to heal it. His blood is the poison that cracked the seal. Take me then, Elara cried, stepping toward the queen. I am his blood, but my heart is for the forest. No, the queen whispered, a cold smile touching her pale lips. You belong to the sun, child. The gate requires someone who has already walked the line. Someone who hears the heartbeat of both worlds. Silas felt a sudden, hollow weight in his stomach. He looked at his hands. The black ink of the shadowhounds had spread up his forearms, etching patterns like ancient, dark ivy into his skin. The walker is the key, the great grizzly rumbled, its voice filled with a heavy, somber respect. He has the ear of the wing and the ear of the stone. He is the only one the low dark will obey. If I go, Silas said, his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart, the village stays safe? The animals, they won't have to fight your hounds anymore. The gate will be sealed with your presence, the queen promised. You will be the warden of the vale. You will walk the border between the light and the dark, ensuring the balance is never tipped again. But you can never return to the world of men. Your voice will belong to the wild, and your name will become a myth. Elara grabbed Silas's arm, her eyes burning with tears. Silas, no. You saved us. You can't be a prisoner of the dark. Silas looked at her, then at the villagers who were finally breathing clean air for the first time in their lives. He looked at the animals, the dogs, the horses, the birds, who had risked everything for a man who could finally hear them. I was always a prisoner of the village's silence, Elara, Silas said softly. In the dark, I'll finally be home. He turned to the queen and held out his blackened hand. As their fingers touched, the violet storm let out a final, triumphant roar, and the earth began to seal itself over the ruins of Oakhaven. The warden's silence. The violet light did not fade. It folded. As Silas's fingers locked with the queen's, the earth beneath the ruins of Oakhaven let out a final, thunderous groan. The great hall, the paved square, and the jagged stone walls were pulled deep into the mantle of the world. In their place, a great, silver-barked willow erupted from the soil, its roots weaving a cage of ancient wood over the breach. Silence fell over the valley, a true, living silence. Elara stood at the edge of the high vale, her hand reaching out into the empty air. Silas was gone. The queen was gone. The only thing that remained was the whispering of the wind through the new willow's leaves. He sleeps in the silver root. He breathes in the sap. The cicadas began to buzz, their song no longer a warning, but a lullaby. The warden wakes where the sun never burns. He keeps the hounds at the heel. Years passed, and the valley changed. The villagers did not rebuild their stone nest. Instead, they followed Elara's lead, building small, timber-framed homes nestled within the natural clearings of the forest. They lived in harmony with the wild, their crops protected not by walls, but by the birds that ate the locusts and the wolves that kept the deer from the tender shoots. The chief lived a long life, his eyes always turned toward the great willow. He never spoke of his crown again, only of the mercy of a hunter who had seen the soul of a queen in a pregnant deer. Elara became the village's first speaker. She taught the children to listen, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. She told them the story of Silas, the man who gave up his voice so that the world wouldn't have to scream. The walker is near. He watches from the bark. The village dogs would bark whenever a stranger approached the valley with ill intent. The stranger would suddenly find the forest turning into a labyrinth, the thorns thickening and the owls hooting in a rhythmic, terrifying chorus until the intruder fled in a panic. Deep within the forbidden vale, near the mirror pool, a figure sat on a throne of bone and moss. Silas's skin was now the color of starlight, and his eyes held the depth of the violet sky. He no longer felt the assault of the animals' voices. He was the source of their song. Beside him sat a great hind, her coat shimmering with the same golden light he had seen on that first fateful day. She rested her head on his knee, her pulse a steady, comforting rhythm in his mind. "The balance is held, warden," the hind whispered into his soul. Silas looked toward the distant lights of the new village. He saw Elara, now an old woman, sitting by a fire and telling his story to a circle of wide-eyed children. He felt a flicker of human warmth, a phantom of the man he once was. "They remember," Silas thought, his voice echoing through every leaf and every wing in the valley. They finally know how to listen. The shadows of the underworld paced behind the great willow's roots, their obsidian bones clicking in the dark, but they did not cross the line. The gate was sealed. The hunter had spared the deer, and in doing so, he had spared the world. The story of Oakhaven was no longer a saga of stone and blood. It was a song of the wild, sung by the wind, the rain, and the warden who lived in the silence.